Recently, I reviewed Final Fantasy XIII and concluded that while the game does things I don't like and gets the worst out of me at times, I still really love what the game is. Therefore, when Final Fantasy XIII-2 was released back in 2012, I had high hopes. Hopes that the sequel would improve the things I didn't like, while of course maintaining the core of its design that I do like. Though big changes were planned for Final Fantasy XIII-2. This was noticeable in the marketing of the game, but the words from the director himself, Motomu Toryama, made it also very clear they wanted a different experience going forward. Now, did they succeed at creating a player-driven experience where gameplay and story are directly influenced by the player's choice? Or was this design from the beginning not a good idea as it changed too much of the foundation the prequel created? Well, let's find out, shall we? But before we do, a quick warning going into this review. Final Fantasy XIII-2 heavily leans on the ending of the first game. And while the marketing of this game spoils the ending without any problem, and I kinda see it as no problem either, I still try to talk as little as possible about the ending itself. But as the stories are so woven into each other, I can't fully avoid spoilers for the first game. Alright, you have been warned, now let's get started. The story of Final Fantasy XIII-2 continues right where its prequel left us. After the events of the previous game unfolded, something strange has happened to Sarah's sister, Lightning. She has vanished all of a sudden, but what makes it even stranger is that Sarah seems to be the only one remembering her sister to be there with them at the end. Are her memories true, or is she struggling with the loss of her dear sister? Nobody believes her as she's the only one with such memories. Until a mysterious meteor falls from the sky and a person, Null, appeared in front of her, claiming he was sent by lightning back in time to find Sarah so that they can save mankind from its doomed future. In the hopes to find her sister, Sarah sets off together with Null on this quest. They travel across the ages to learn of the doomed future and finding ways to steer mankind away from it. But he who changes the future changes the past. Playing around with time is very tricky and could do more harm than good, and it's up to our heroes to make the right decisions and of course, course corrections. Final Fantasy XIII was a story about fate, and its sequel, Final Fantasy XIII-2, is a story about time, which is an interesting setup and continuation of a story. And while I like the idea of indirectly setting up a story with a very underlying complex element, I don't really like a time travel story. Not just in Final Fantasy XIII-2, but in general. There are only a select few of those stories that can avoid plot holes or theoretical solutions that could make the whole plot irrelevant, or they just don't avoid becoming a contradicting, convoluted mess. And Final Fantasy XIII-2 does not escape this fate whatsoever. But in comparison with other stories involving time traveling, this one stays on the more bearable side of things. Mainly because the story presents your actions as corrections/fixes to the original timeline, then constant changes to a timeline that you have to keep track of. Another reason why the time traveling stays bearable is the big improvement on story dialogue. I really disliked the fact that Final Fantasy XIII's story required more or less a lot of reading codex entries, as the dialogue in cutscenes did not suffice to tell the story properly. Here, a lot of time is spent on dialogue explaining what is actually happening, what the stakes are, and how our characters want to move forward. And while this is an overall big improvement compared to the sequel, it did create two new problems. The first one being that the story feels like a constant charge while bombing you with explanation after explanation, making the stakes and conflicts feel very rushed and not properly set up. They just have the characters tell you what to know before charging forward again. Rarely does the story slow down and, for example, develop the characters and their relationship and show off nice, fun, interesting chemistry between them. Which brings me to problem number 2. Throughout the whole game, it felt like Sarah and Null were just there to give the explanations needed, instead of evolving as character and grow towards each other as friends and their goals. It are those elements that made the six-headed party of Final Fantasy XIII so memorable. Their chemistry, their interaction, and their growth, individually and together. And that is missing here for most of the time. The story tries, but ultimately fails, making Sarah and Null feel disconnected from each other throughout the whole game. The most interesting character, if you ask me, is this story's antagonist, Gaius. He opposes our heroes in a very classic villainous fashion, which I really like. But under the surface, his motive can be debated as being good, or at least very understandable, which creates a very interesting point of view that could spark some really good debates. Yet the game ignores that, and in the end, his character felt just as underdeveloped as Sarah and Null was. In particular, Sarah was a big disappointment for me. This game offered a mirrored story of the previous one. Last game we played mostly as the big sister trying to save the little sister. And now we got the little sister trying to save/find her big sister. But whereas Lightning showed growth throughout the whole story, Sarah does not and stays the same throughout the whole game, which is very unfortunate. The few moments the story does have these elements are moments where we meet the old cast of characters. Some of them even play a nice background role in this story, making the game at least feel connected to the prequel and even continues development of those characters to a degree. And while these moments were great, they were also a strong reminder of what I was missing. The world itself, however, is still very interesting and actually gains the most out of the time travel story. After the events of Final Fantasy XIII-2, the world changes drastically and we get to see up close the effects it has on humanity. From early beginnings where mankind is still trying to find footing in this changed world, to completely overcoming and developing beyond their old ways later in the future. This is also where putting up a lot of time understanding the world in the previous game by reading loads of codex entries pays off, making the enjoyment of the world even better. And while the world is quickly changing as we warp through decades of time, it manages to keep a feeling of similarity. Even the new areas fit in well with the Final Fantasy XIII style of technology and design. Be it landscapes, buildings, cities, or even the creatures themselves you encounter, it all still feels very similar. Heck, some of the creatures are even directly taken from the previous game. Though fighting them and the overall gameplay itself is where a big change from the previous game comes in. To quickly get back to the words of Motomu Toryama, the main objective was to develop a game offering maximum freedom to players. They wanted the sequel to be a player-driven experience where gameplay and story are directly influenced by the player's choices. Now, as we are circling back to the beginning of the review, I will ask the same question again. Did they manage to do that? Story-wise, no. Gameplay-wise, yeah, no, sorta. Depends heavily which element you look at. It's a bit complicated. Map design got a huge improvement. As I mentioned before, visually they are great and match the Final Fantasy XIII feeling. But here in Final Fantasy XIII-2, the maps support a lot more exploration. And as you progress through the game, you unlock abilities that can open maps even further. There are also locations that do offer a completely alternative situation to the main timeline. Those are interesting what-if locations to explore as a side quest. You even get to temporarily alter the timeline to unlock certain maps or areas for special items or unique creatures, which makes trips back to old locations interesting and worthwhile, even after finishing the game. The game also introduced cinematic actions and life triggers, which are fancy names for QTEs and dialogue choices. The cinematic actions does add a nice, fun little layer to cutscenes and battles. They even reward you if your timing is on point, but it's unfortunate that they kept the usage of this particular element to a very bare minimum. The opening in the game shows off this mechanic in a very great way, where you switch between boss battle phases with this system, making the whole fight feel connected and immersive. But after this amazing game opening, this mechanic seems to disappear and only appear in small bits during other boss battles. But they are few and far between to create a strong impact. Life triggers, aka dialogue choices on the other hand, happen a lot more often, but those are a lot more shallow than the cinematic actions. They are mostly cosmetic dialogue choices, as whatever you choose doesn't really change the actual dialogue or its outcome. I wish they did though, as I would love to have the option to ditch Snow and cast him into the void forever to be never seen again. But I digress. There are a select few dialogue choices that will change the ending of the story, but not only are those choices not really subtle, and they feel more like bonus endings than actual endings. Overall, these elements mimic very well what they set out to create. Keyword mimic, as their impact is either weak or kept at a bare minimum. So saying they succeeded in those elements is a very hard sell. But then there is the combat. Final Fantasy XIII-2 uses the same combat system from Final Fantasy XIII as a foundation and improves a lot of it, and even manages to add its own spin to it. Instead of the traditional Final Fantasy turn-based combat where you command each character of your party individually, you are now a battle observer and function as the leader of a 3-person party. Throughout battles, you make calls on which roles you and the other characters in your party have to play or switch between. As battles are in real time, you must be able to make quick decisions on what to do and trust your party members to fulfill their role properly, as this instruction is the only control you really have over them. What is new here and changed from the previous game is that your party always consists of the same 2 characters and that the only open slot is constantly swapped between creatures that you can collect. These creatures do have a set role that can't be changed, so you have to pick wisely which creature you are going to put in one of the 3 slots for your party. It's a fair attempt to create a more interesting element with the paradigm system, as characters usually have the luxury of having multiple roles. But with these creatures, that luxury is taken away a bit and brings a limit to the system and thereby adding weight to the choices you make. They also expanded the leveling system. You still get to pick which class/role each character levels up, but once a leveled threshold is met, your skill tree expands to a new level, which offers you new unlocks, bonus attributes, skills, and even new roles. These elements are all big changes, and I would say they succeeded here in what they tried to set out to do. Choices in the way you build your characters and party feels more impactful, while at the same time feel more fair. As a Pokemon fan, I like the collecting creatures aspect, though it's not just a nice novelty, it adds a serious layer to the choices you make for the combat. And while of course you can mess up these choices, the game feels a lot less punishing for messing up than its predecessor was. Though that might also be because the game is a lot easier than the predecessor. Which sparks an interesting point. Normal and boss battle encounters in Final Fantasy XIII felt like an uphill battle for most of the time, and if you make a mistake you had to work even harder to compensate for that, or you would just get wiped off the board because of it. Many battles were won before they even started, and even when you are in control, you're not really in control all the time, as the battles also involved things like luck. As I stated in my review of Final Fantasy XIII, this constant challenge is a good and a bad thing. And while the satisfaction of beating these challenges is great, it can also cause burnouts, as you constantly have to charge in, plan, trial and error, just constant fighting to overcome these challenges. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, it feels to me like they knew this and therefore deliberately dialed the game down quite a bit. For me, playing this game felt way more relaxing than the previous one, as I didn't need to work through a large pile of homework that consisted of story codex entries and gameplay mechanics explanations that I need to understand to even make a small bit of progress. And while I'm not a person that really cares for difficulty in games, I will be honest, I did miss the satisfaction of beating challenges that the previous game offered so well. But despite that, I would call this version of the combat here in Final Fantasy XIII a big improvement and a better version of what came before. But that unfortunately does not go for the entire game. If we put the clear mistake of sidelining lightning in this game aside, there are still things I wouldn't consider to be better or improved on. Changed, definitely. But not all change is good. In particular, the story. While it has an interesting idea, and heck, it even made the time travel element bearable, it ultimately failed to tell a story, as it was more busy explaining it. And it focused so much on that it forgot to do many other things, like developing the characters themselves, ruining their great potential and making them just feel very shallow. On the other hand, we have the combat, where the changes are in most ways very good. While again, I do miss the satisfaction of beating challenge after challenge after challenge, the overall enjoyment was a lot higher here, as most encounters were easier, and with the game not being so harsh about mistakes you make, I felt more comfortable in making choices, be that in tactics, leveling up, or the monsters I used. What I probably enjoyed the most out of Final Fantasy XIII-2 is that it connects perfectly with the game that came before. It felt like I've returned to a world I knew, yet at the same time, it felt really fresh, new and unique with its own identity as it changed with time. And I think that is why I always enjoy Final Fantasy XIII so much, and why many call this a great sequel. Of course, seeing Lightning being turned into a badass warrior goddess fighting an even doper villain helped a lot, but I digress again. Final Fantasy XIII-2 overall manages to do different things for better or worse, yet stay strongly connected to what came before. Theoretically, you could play this game standalone. The connections to the previous game and the way the story is written is just solid enough for that. Would I recommend doing that? Only if you truly feel the need or curiosity to do so. In that case, it might be good to check out some summary/lore videos before diving in. But still, if you want to play this game and properly experience it, in my honest opinion, you have to play Final Fantasy XIII as well. And that might sound like a challenge or an obstacle, but thankfully the PC port comes with an easy mode, and that makes the game a lot easier. And you can even cheat your way through the game just to get the full story if you want to. But if you don't feel like that or not willing to do so, then unfortunately, I would not recommend playing Final Fantasy XIII-2.